Hi, welcome back to our next episode here of the South Texas Power Lunch. I'm with Iris Gonzalez of Startups San Antonio. Want to make sure it's plural there, startupssanantonio.com. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thanks so much, Matt.
We're going to do a very interesting podcast here, which I'm excited about, to talk about funding for all of the startups here in our community. But we're going to do it a little bit of a twist here because you're going to do a little bit of interviewing me. I'm going to do a little bit of interviewing you about things going on in our community. But it's going to be an exciting time. I really appreciate you being here with us on it.
Well, thanks so much, Matt.
Let's talk a little bit about funding, just in the general aspect of funding around here. What do you see going on in San Antonio as far as the funding in our community? What are the different types that are going on, those sort of things?
Well, when you look at our ecosystem, we don't have as dense a population of founders as, say, other cities, but we've seen some really interesting acquisition news and funding news over the past year or so. So I know you've been keeping track of that as well.
I have.
What I find that our community really needs is easy answers to questions that most first-time founders have. So when I interview first-time founders, they're grappling with quite a bit when they're starting their new company. It's not only product market fit and how to get traction, but I know a lot of them start thinking very early on about how to be ready for funding.
Right.
So I thought, in the interest of our audience, could you maybe take a moment and explain all the different types of funding rounds and stages, starting with the very early stage. So you just launched your startup. What would be typically the first type of funding that a first-time founder would be looking at for their startup?
No, it's a good question, and we've got such a great ecosystem to get young entrepreneurs, young companies up and running.
Yes.
But then there's a big jump of funding, because every great idea takes money in order for it to be executed. Really, the first round starts with friends, family, the network that you already have. And the funding of that and what that looks like from a legal aspect could be a loan. It could be that you're selling part of your company early on. That's not typically what's done, but it's typically somebody loaning money. That's done, friends and family. Once you get through that, then you're really looking for outside investors to come in, and that could be in what it's called a pre-seed round. Pre-seed, we've talked about a little bit on this show. We had the Alamo Angels, Sebastian Garzon here, really around the $500,000, maybe up to $1 million. Pre-seed, looking at angel investors, maybe some more high net worth individuals that are out there in early stage companies. And then from there, it really progresses. You're looking into more venture capital, and you could get yourself into a seed round, a series A, B, C. We deal with companies that are in series H rounds. It just depends upon their business model. So there's a wide range of funding models that go. And the ultimate one for a lot of people is an IPO. That's what everybody aspires to be, that next initial public offering out there and listed on the stock exchanges.
And so could you also talk about what the valley of death is? The valley of death for founders, right?
The valley
that's
of
what
death.
They're trying to avoid. They don't want to get stuck in the valley of death.
The valley of death. We've had some good conversations on this podcast about the valley of death. But that valley of death is where you go from the first bit of funding that you received. Again, whether it's friends, whether it's family. And then you start to find out as you operationalize that and move that forward that you're going to need some more cash. And once you start that pendulum or that flywheel moving and it starts moving, in order to keep it going, you've got to keep funding it. And some people find that they run out of money. And when they run out of money, unfortunately, there's payroll, there's technology fees, license agreements, all the things that it costs to move, specifically technology companies, that you can find yourself out of cash. And in every single business, cash is king. The minute you run out of cash, you're in a big trouble. And this is for really, for even established businesses. We've got clients that have acquired great businesses that ran out of cash, and that was it. So being a good steward of your cash, and then just understanding, can you raise enough at the right moment? Because if not, you're going to be in the valley of death because you can't get out of it because you need that cash.
And so the term that I hear a lot of founders using is runway. How much runway you have left is What?
Well, your runway is, how much cash you have left. And so in order to understand your runway, you got to look at your burn rate. What's your monthly burn that's going on? And there's some ways you can minimize things. You can manage things from a legal standpoint. Sometimes there's some things of renegotiating contracts to reduce that burn rate. But you look at your burn rate and your runway, and that tells you how long before you're in the valley of death.
Well, that's a good point then. So you mentioned legal issues. It sounds to me, does every startup founder need to hire a lawyer? And if so, when is the ideal time?
The answer is yes. You should always hire your friendly neighborhood lawyer there. The timing is interesting. When you're first starting out as a concept, I always tell my clients or potential clients, you need to hire the lawyer. You need to have a lawyer as an advisor, but you need to actually hire a lawyer when you're about to receive that first investment, when you're about to do your first actual formal part of operations. When you're putting your business strategy together, when you're trying to conceptualize things, when you're working on your business plan, I talk with a lot of entrepreneurs that are looking at spending thousands of dollars on legal fees when they don't need it yet. In addition to that, I always encourage founders to look at doing the legal, what they need for where they are on their journey versus where they're going to be. A prime example of that is in the state of Texas, we can use a limited liability company as a pass-through entity. It can also become just like a C corporation. More to come on if you want to Google what those differences are. But I see a lot of people that say, I need a Delaware C Corp on day one. Well, That's pretty expensive to do. And if you're just in the stage of the friends and family, I encourage people, maybe you start with a single member LLC, which is much cheaper, much simpler to do. And then you can, if you're getting debt, you can do it there. Save your money and spend it on your business operations. And then on that day when you start getting outside investors, we can convert that or merge that in. But there's new money coming in that would pay for those additional legal fees that are incremental versus spending so much to put in structures that are down that road as opposed to where you are today. So it just depends where you are, but it's really when you're starting to take that money or take that operational step, you should make sure you have that attorney that's on a retainer for you.
Well, that's a really solid piece of advice because I have heard founders debate that issue of should I go ahead and do a C Corp from the very beginning. Not every startup makes it.
Correct.
There is a high failure rate. So I think it's wise then that you counsel wait until you get everything established, ducks in a row, and then once you're really seriously looking at, say, your first funding round, then you can start looking at what your long-term prospects are and look at what point will I need to become a corporation, a Delaware corporation.
Just as an example, we've had, through this year, I think we've had about 20 startups we've dealt with. I've only done 2 C Corps, Delaware C Corps. Oh, okay. That's it. And the reason is you look at your runway and say, when is this going to be necessary? For some people, just getting that concept off the ground and shopping that for the fundraising aspect, that could take months. For some people, it took a couple of years because of COVID. Why have spent your runway on legal fees before you were actually getting in new capital? Work with your advisor, your financial team, work with your lawyers to say when is that right spend based upon wherever you are on the journey.
Very good advice. So let's assume that a startup founder is chugging along, doing good work. They're getting ready for a first big funding round. They have a great lawyer that's giving them really solid advice.
Right.
What would be the checklist that you would give your client to say, hey, you need to be ready for funding? Right. What are the key things that you need to do and to get done on your checklist?
So from a lawyer standpoint, one of the biggest things from a lawyer is be organized. We deal with startups. We deal with individual investors, angel investors, high net worth individuals. I can tell immediately based upon how well prepared a founder is by how organized they are. It starts with making sure they have the right team. Operational team, that's their business. But do you have somebody that's a financial advisor or someone that's financially on your team? Because inevitably, it's about the money. And making sure that you have all of that organized financial statements, I would say, is number one. Number two is making sure from a legal standpoint, are all your corporate documents in order? Because as people and investors start to dig into really the nuts and bolts of an investment, These are some things that are just fundamental, foundational, should be checkboxes. When they're not, or they become issues, that becomes a potential red flag to an investor. Even if there's a great business idea, and even if, more importantly, there's a great leader behind it, that could be a gap that is flagged for an investor. So making sure your corporate documents are in order, your certificate of formations, your company agreement. Are you the right entity based upon what you're trying to fundraise? And then from there, there's a series of documents that go with every single offering. One of them we call a private placement memorandum if you're selling an interest in your company. That's going to have a summary of the business. That's going to have certain risk factors. These are important from a security standpoint to make sure that we're making disclosures to an investor. I've dealt with companies that when you say things like PPM, they say, what are you talking about? Well, as an investor wanting to invest in a company, if I can't get those boxes checked, if I don't have adequate assurances, it can be a real barrier to raising some funds from the sophisticated investors that are out there. And then there's a whole host of other documents that come, subscription agreements and questionnaires, and that's really for that legal team to make sure that they're supporting you in what you do, but organization is the key.
So this is part of what venture capitalists or VCs kind of call due diligence.
Sure.
Doing that due diligence to see, is this a company that's solid, that's on solid ground, and then at the same time they're looking at the team, the product market fit, the traction, what their plan is for scaling operations.
That's right.
But you have to have your house in order.
You have to have the house in order. I mean, in the house is a good analogy. We got to make sure the foundation's solid, those company agreements. We need to make sure the AC units working, that the water's running, that everything has an operational. That's those documents we talked about, PPM. When you actually decide to buy the house, is it in the right neighborhood? Do I like the layout? Those are all the operational issues. That's what you need for your pitch deck. That's what your, the vision, what you're selling, to the public, and what someone's investing in. Those are the necessary parts, but you still got to make sure that the foundation and everything else is working. So that's the legal part.
Good. And, if you think about guests dropping in and you see a messy house. I mean, we're always saying, no, I didn't come to see you. I didn't come to see the house. It's okay.
Right.
But when it comes to investing in a business, very different. You should have everything sparkling.
Absolutely.
Everything
right.
organized, neat, readily
Absolutely
available, no lag time, because they can tell that you're scrambling behind the scenes trying to come up with paperwork.
And as you move down that journey, by the way, at the friends and family level, are they checking to see, are you in good standing with the secretary of the comptroller's office? No. Right? It's gonna be easy at that point in time. When you move into some of the angels or high net worth individuals, they start to ask a little bit more. As we move into the Series A, Series B, these higher level VCs, that organization and that sophistication has to come. Didn't have to be there necessarily for the friends and family. All the way to the IPO, the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, is involved, and we're talking thousands upon thousands of documents that have to be sent out to the public. So as you go down that journey, that house becomes more sophisticated in what's prepared, but nonetheless, it always has to be organized.
Now, we're talking about traditional forms of investing. Angel investors, family and friends first,
right.
Angel investors. Maybe can you explain a moment a difference between an angel investor and a venture capitalist?
Sure, and there's a lot of, in doing this, I've seen there's a lot of people that will wear both hats, or they'll say they're the in-between. From purist standpoint, your angel investors are looking at very early stage companies. They've got a little bit of an operations moving forward. They have a somewhat of a track record. You're looking at things like I've got revenue, as opposed to being pre-revenue, which the angels will be in. An angel is really looking at a very early stage. Most venture capitalists are looking for operations, revenue being generated, and there's some sort of investment that needs to accelerate that revenue or to enhance that business team that's out there. You're looking at typically around $500,000 to $1 million of funding round for an angel investor. Usually you're looking at over $1 million, and really it can go up to $50 million for a venture capitalist, maybe even beyond. So there's a financial piece of this, and then there's really just a journey piece of this. And again, some people blur the lines.
Right. Well, okay, so we've talked about friends and family, we've talked about angels, we've talked about VCs. What about startups that do things like Kickstarter, for example,
Sure.
or crowdfunding campaigns.
Right.
Is that something that you recommend in some cases, perhaps maybe early on, or are there some pitfalls to avoid?
There's some pitfalls to avoid that. I mean, the SEC has amended the rules to allow for Kickstarters. What I see a lot of conversation around Kickstarters is usually around product development. Because with a Kickstarter, there's an investment and a fundraising that comes, and then there's usually a kicker, right? I have a remarkable tablet here. I believe it was a Kickstarter when I was doing my research. You got a discount if you were an investment, so I got an additional investment, and I got a discount when I wanted to buy the product. Or sometimes you do the investment and you get a product with it. The crowdfunding rules that are out there provide a wider access to the public, but it has some additional strings that are attached to it. And so typically what we're dealing with larger scale SaaS companies. We had a guest last week that was on regenerative farming that were out there. Large sums of money, not really set up from a marketing standpoint to get incremental investments from a crowdfunding. You typically see that on the product side.
I can guess which startup that is. Wholesome Meats?
No.
Oh, it's the carbon capture?
No, this is another small startup that's actually in West Texas that was out here with us.
West
and now
Texas.
They're into
Okay,
South
good
Texas.
to know.
There's a lot more of that going on.
My curiosity gets the better of me.
No, it's good. There was a whole podcast. Check our last episode on that for the podcast,
now
because
people are gonna be curious.
It's fascinating to me what's going on and taking what is something that's been done for thousands of years, and we've industrialized it. And now, based upon regenerative land, you're actually going back. It looks like we're going backwards, but we're actually going to make it better for the environment, for consumers, for our health. And there's an economic interest to that's fascinating,
right?
based
so
on
then
subsidies.
It factors into the funding strategy, I imagine.
It is, which, from a funding, to take it just a little bit off it, one of the things we haven't talked about is you can get funding from a customer. What sometimes people miss the fact is I can have a great service or I can have a great product, and one customer who needs it so much can actually fund enough for me to develop it. Had a client that was doing some technology around COVID. Great example of these type of opportunities during COVID.
Right.
High demand, limited supply. A customer would pay for someone to develop, passports, COVID passports when those looked like they were needed. So they would go ahead and say, I will fund you to do this startup. I will pay you $300,000. I need this provided back to me. But by the way, you can also commercialize it to third parties as long as I have the exclusive license. There's a lot of examples of this, of single source vendors or dual source contracts that someone could achieve and then develop their startup around it and use that as a funding source at the beginning. More contractual based of funding versus investment based of funding.
So that's also like product pre-sales?
Product pre-sales is a good way to look at that as well. You see that a lot with the Kickstarter type stuff, as well as combining those aspects together. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways to get creative for funding.
Well, that also makes me think of free sources of funding, equity-free funding, like an SBIR or an STTR grant.
Sure.
So maybe you can take a moment to explain what that particular source of funding is and how it might help a particular type of startup founder.
Well, let's talk about grants in general, because grants provide two benefits. Economically, as you were saying, they almost always are an equity-free source of funding, meaning I'm not debt, which many times in an early stage can be convertible, which means it actually is dilutive to equity. These grants are typically given in exchange for, certain operational achievements that are out there. Free money. And these, so there's the economic aspect. There's also another aspect, which we've talked a little bit about on our podcast series, of the validation, because so many investors are looking at your track record and those that have been supporting you to say, is this a safe investment as far as giving my capital or investing in them? To go through the grant process, and you talked about the Small Business Administration, there's the DoD has programs out there. There are other programs such as Geekdom that are out here for SaaS. So there's a private grants that are out there. These are great ways to actually have your company validated and not have to give up any equity. Some of the things from a legal standpoint to look on these grants, though, is making sure you look at the fine print. I have run into some where grants are given, but there's some strings attached. So it's not truly free. The DoD can typically have some, licensing issues that you can come into, so intellectual property issues may come into it. You want to make sure it truly is equity free and not convertible on certain things, or if there's any sort of restrictions on your operations on the go forward, which these are very rare, but it's important that as you get those grants to have a lawyer look at that to make sure that there's not some unnecessary restriction or surprise that you didn't realize that was in there for those type of grants. But they are great early to mid funding sources, again, from an equity-free standpoint and also to validate what you're doing.
So in other words, if a founder wins some type of maybe local competition and they get a small amount, but it's say in a safe note, would that then be a good recommendation? Hey, before you sign on a dotted line, have your lawyer
Sure.
review the terms of the safe note before you sign it.
That's right. And from a safe note standpoint, simple agreement for future equity, those vary. People think, oh, well, just send me the safe note. I just want to make sure that everybody understands from a legal standpoint. There are a lot of industry standard, from a venture capital standpoint, the NAIC, if I'm remembering my acronym correctly, they have their model documents that have helped to streamline and save costs. But you should always make sure that even if it's a model document, someone reviews it, because typically lawyers make tweaks. Mm-hmm. And again, I would just, caution people to look through those. But typically those have an either or, and sometimes they're at the option of the holder or the maker for those safe notes with regard to that future equity. Sometimes you can take a safe note and down the line when there's a qualifying event, you as maker get the ability to say, here's your money back with interest, thank you very much. Or them as holder have they have the option to say, oh, I want to go ahead and convert, I don't want my money back. Those are the type of things that people throw around generic terms, but there are some customizable aspects of all of these documents.
Okay, that's good to know. So then, for going back a moment to the SBIR grant, I just wanted to explain that it's a small business innovation and research grant program.
Right.
It's not just DoD, but NASA, Department of Energy,
right.
NIH will have this type of grant money available, but your solution has to fit a problem that they have.
Right.
So all of these websites, the grant websites, will have the top needs outlined, and then you take a look at how you can match that government need for innovation with your particular product idea,
right.
service. And then phase one is typically $50,000, very rigorous. So it also provides that validation to potential investors. Correct. To say, oh, so you got a phase one SBIR grant, not a lot of money, $50,000, but that tells me that a team of scientists reviewed your application and found it to be very promising.
Right.
And then there's, as you say, conditions to fulfill. Usually you get 90 days to get a working memorandum of understanding that says you found at least one client, one mm-hmm. government client that's going to use your prototype. And then the phase two, the numbers are much bigger. If you make it all the way to phase three, then you're using government money to develop something for, say, DoD.
Sure.
But it doesn't preclude you from then, once you get it to market, using that product and other funding to sell it and maybe sell it to the civilian sector.
And these are all great programs. And from a legal aspect to throw in is people that are in my industry, so I'm a transactional business lawyer, because people say, what do you do? I'm like, I'm a deal lawyer, but it's a transactional business lawyer. We deal with startups, we deal with M&A, mergers, acquisitions. When you get these specific, it's also important to make sure that you as the founder are making sure you have the right team. We don't deal here a lot in the federal regs that are out there for all of these programs. We're more in the private space. We don't do a whole lot of grant writing. That doesn't mean that we don't have the expertise that can be brought in, but making sure that you have the right validated team, mm-hmm. legal team, mm-hmm. financial team mm-hmm. for your industry that you're in and your strategy is critical. Because what you don't want is somebody like me coming in and going, oh, that's a great grant. Oh, I looked at it. When you're dealing with the federal government, there are references to references. By the way, there are hidden references which says, hey, here's a statute and it governs all these type of agreements, whether that agreement even says that it's in there or not, versus in the private world, we have statutes, but largely it's left to individuals to negotiate their contracts. So you don't have something that's in the overhead that's overriding what you do. So making sure that you have someone that's versed in federal grants, federal contracting, very niche practices is important, or somebody that's been down that road. Because even the business people, once you've gone down the road a couple of times, you understand how it works. But it's very much a red tape, as you were bringing up. Lots of stringent rules on people.
Oh, and shameless plug here. If you know, because I write about a lot of startups that have gotten SBIR funding, and because it's so arcane, I wound up going down a rabbit hole, and I have 2 guest posts, 2 articles on startupsanantonio.com. If you search for articles on SBIR tips, I got the nation's leading expert.
Wow.
She's a consultant that works with companies all the time to make sure that their submissions are as good as they can be for chances of being successfully picked up for funding. So there's 2 articles that kind of talk about everything you need to know about SBIR and STTR funding.
Great.
And then tips and lessons learned on how to submit a successful submission. You can find them on Startup San Antonio.
Which is great, because the best thing you can do is find somebody that's already been down the road.
It is a niche.
It is a niche. And that really goes for mentorship. I mean, your right team. And making sure that your right team is transparent to say, hey, this is my skill set. This is not my skill set.
Right.
Is important, because not everybody can be an expert in everything with regard to startups. We'd love to be, right? We have general knowledge, but to really, for some of these, like you said, arcane rules, one little misstep could be detrimental to a great source and a great validation.
Exactly.
That's exactly right.
So, but you also mentioned, because your focus is on transactional clients, businesses that are looking to make deals. So how about if you can spend a moment talking about SBA grants, micro grants, the kind of business loans that are available for small businesses just starting out? Yeah,
so the SBA program, it's been interesting here over the last 3 years. SBA is essentially tied to a bank, a financial institution, and they will usually ask as a guarantor, essentially, of some of these loans. Again, very arcane, check the box, making sure everything's in order. We deal a lot with people at the last minute. They're like, ooh, I don't have my company agreement. There's 4 of us and I don't have anything to document it. So making sure, again, that your foundation, no matter where you are on the journey, is solid is important. But interestingly enough, we're learning a lot more about how the SBA is going to act with some of these businesses that actually didn't make it during COVID. And some things to be aware is, just because you get an SBA grant or even an SBA loan, and sometimes there's some combinations, sometimes is payback that has to occur if the business isn't successful. Sometimes to think about that. For the grants that come to you, typically it's the business that has the risk to it, not individuals. When you get into an SBA loan, many times there are personal guarantees. And, unfortunately, when businesses don't go the right way for some startups, we've got a couple right now we're dealing with. It can ripple out of that what was a great idea and something you thought gave you personal protection. But when you sign that personal guarantee, you really have popped that bubble with regard to a lender or a landlord in those circumstances. And because times are tough, for landlords and a little bit on banks, becomes a negotiation, on those. So just something to think about as well when you're doing that. There's great programs, but just understanding, are you giving up some personal risk for those, is something to look at as well.
So that's another good reason why a founder launching a new company should talk to a lawyer.
Absolutely.
And say, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. Do you think, this looks good? And then you can tell them what the long-term implications could be if things don't work out.
Absolutely. One of the things that I enjoy the most is walking through with business owners, founders, long-term business owners, to talk about pros and cons. Because unfortunately, we would love to say, sign this piece of paper, we guarantee this is what will happen to you. We can't. There's risk and reward into everything. And so going through we get sometimes where some people say, look, I've got to sign this contract. It's not good terms. In fact, I'm going to lose a little bit of money on it, but it gets me moving forward with it. sometimes the right answer, unfortunately, is not the best, thing that has to be done, but we can advise as to pros and cons of the risk. It's really important you have a lawyer that can work that through with you. One of the things I'll tell you, too, that I see from a lot of founders of a quick tip is be careful how you sign things.
Oh, really?
So many times I get into, and this is even we've got some very large Fortune 50 companies that we do general corporate work for, and I have gotten from time to time where somebody signs a document in their individual capacity.
Oh, so that means personal risk and liability.
Potentially, right?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but
right.
that's what it sounds like.
But you got it, right? I mean, there's enough of that. And so being very careful, to have, if you're going to be signing something, to understand enough of, do I have a lawyer look at this to know what I'm signing, and am I signing it right?
That's a very good tip.
I have people that, just as another tip from a signing standpoint, letters of intent, memorandums of understanding, many times these are non-binding. People come to me, clients come to me and say, hey, can you draft a letter of intent? I'm like, look, where you are, you're really at a deal point. Just put it in an email, but don't sign it because then that becomes a contract. Or if someone, is forcing you to sign something, let us take a look at it. Make sure it's non-binding. There are stages to where we want things to be non-binding as business negotiation to binding as we need everybody to be held accountable. Anytime there's signatures, just be cognizant of what you're signing and what capacity, and is it really necessary to do so?
I'm not signing anything from now on. Well, and it's because just depositing money into your business account.
Sure.
Right? The banks will tell you, okay, if you have an LLC, for example, you need to sign your name.
Right.
But you have to put down, Iris Gonzalez, owner.
Right.
Of the entity, and
Correct.
because you're signing on behalf of the entity.
Correct.
And a lot of people may not think about that, especially if they have more than one business entity. I
That's
know
right.
people that have multiples.
That's right. And making sure, we deal a lot with individuals that have holding companies in different industries, and one of the first things, like, John Wooden, make sure your laces are tied before you get into the basketball game, is when you're dealing in a transaction, make sure you get the right entity there. Make sure you get the right signer there, because if you don't, you can create a lot of confusion and create unnecessary risk.
Right, or having to redo the paperwork, and of course that's more fees.
That's more fees. And while we make more money, it just doesn't do good from a value standpoint,
No.
so better to look at it at the front end.
So I think you've done a really great job of kind of talking through all the different kinds of funding, everything from crowdfunding to customer sources of funding like purchase order financing. And I think you hear about that a lot on Shark Tank discussions.
Yeah.
I have a pending purchase order, but I don't have the money to buy the inventory to fill the purchase order. And then you'll hear a shark saying, I'll finance that.
Well,
and you pay me back.
That's right, and you pay it back.
We'll talk about the funding on top of that.
Right, and some people call that factoring. That's out there, and that's another good resource where I've got a contract that's out there, and so I'm going to go ahead and make sure I get paid. Some things to think about for if you ever get into that type of situation is, where does the flow of cash go?
Oh, okay.
And if I'm representing one of the sharks, we're going to say that the money from that purchase order comes into what we would call a lockbox. It's a specific bank account that's set up for the company, but I, as the secured party, have access to where if I'm not getting paid, I can actually go in there and turn off the ability for the company to get it. If I'm a founder, I don't want it to go to a lockbox. I want it to come to me so that way I can pay, because as we talked about runway, burn rate, I may have to manage my cash flow a little bit to make sure I can keep myself during a potential downturn. I'd rather be in control of my cash flow versus letting someone else be in control of my cash flow. So again, if you're dealing with those type of purchase order, security financings, factoring is what some people will call vendor financing, be aware of where the flow of funds go, because that can become an issue if the reason it was tight to begin with becomes a little bit more and you get cut off completely. Cash is king.
Hey, that's another great tip to think about.
Yeah.
So in our remaining 8 or 10 minutes that we have left, I thought it might be good for you to kind of go over the general checklist that any business owner should have uppermost in mind when they're talking about getting ready for any kind of funding.
Any kind of funding.
So first of all, I would imagine they'd have to determine the amount of funding that they really truly need at that particular point in time, because it's going to be different from whether it's an early stage company, whether it's that, or like you say, Series A, B, C, D, or higher. Right. The amounts are much, much bigger.
And this one's a little bit more of an operational, but again, we work as advisors for a lot of these companies. knowing your runway, right? How much
Right.
cash do I have left? And what's my burn rate? Gives me, understanding, how long I'll live, that runway, duration. But then what do you need to use it for? Like, what is it for? A lot of times we see in later, a little bit early to later stage companies is we need that marketing team, that distribution team. Whereas beforehand we needed the product development team. We still need that, but now we need to market and get the distribution out there to actually get our product or our service marketed. What does that cost look like?
Right.
You have to model all those things out and get a good solid pro forma of what are the utilization of funds from that standpoint. Once you do that, and again, that's really working with your financial team, then the lawyers can come in and say, okay, what does that look like from a strategy of that funding? You could look at things where do we want it to be debt? I would always want things to be debt. Why? Because I don't give up equity. Equity is the most expensive asset.
Yes.
When you look at finite resources, I only have so much equity. It's called 100% of the company. And as I give more and more away, I have less and less of it. So we want to hold on to the equity as long as we can. But at some points, equity is needed to fund the company. And that's where the lawyers, the founders, and the finance team work together to figure out if I'm going to do an equity or if I'm going to do a debt offering, what does that look like? What does that conversion look like? What does that do for the dilution of the company? You really get that finance aspect allows you to then do the strategy of how you're going to do the fundraising. And one of the things I also want to just remind the founders on is think about how this looks from a control standpoint. One of my favorite parts of the Facebook social media movie that's escaping me was when Mark Zuckerberg basically shows his co-founders he had Class A shares. And he had been thinking about dilution and control the entire time that they were working with Silicon Valley. That's something, as cold-blooded as it was, founders need to think about as they're going through this entire process is, I know my needs, I know my strategy for fundraising. What does this start to look like in the longer term as far as control and dilution for my personal interest that's out there?
And then your plan for getting the money, the business plan of how you're going to go about getting the money, and then where, as a lawyer, where can you best advise your client on, ways to consider getting money?
Yeah, we have to be a little bit considerate of some of the federal laws with regard to fundraising. Regulation D.
Explain that, please, because I get a lot of questions from founders about that.
The general law of the land is every single security that you are offering or selling to someone in the public, so outside of me, must be registered with the SEC unless there's an exception or an exemption. That's the general rule. So the general rule is it must be registered, just like every single IPO you've ever seen. It has to be, unless it falls within an exemption or an exception to the rules. There's a variety of those, and we could go into an entire podcast of what those are.
Sure.
One of the most familiar ones is Regulation D that people look at. Regulation D has certain requirements on the type of investor you can deal with, what we call an accredited investor.
Mm-hmm.
It has based upon different aspects of Reg D, how much money you can actually fundraise or collectively have fundraised for that offering. And then there's another aspect that gets to your point, which is what can you do to market it? One thing I always want to make sure every founder knows is don't post it on Facebook that you're looking for investors. That would be a public solicitation. In some circumstances, that's okay. In many, you have just handcuffed yourself in your ability to fundraise for the lifetime of your company in some circumstances. So making sure that you know where to market. The materials you want, your pitch deck, that's critical. We deal a lot with actually working with founders and just on their pitch deck. We've done some stuff down at Velocity for their pitch deck. Solid financials. And then what are the utilization of funds? Making sure that when they get into that due diligence part, they can go back and see your financials, your legal work is ready to go and is organized. Those are the type of things that they need to do.
So, of course, people that are thinking of investing in your company, they're doing due diligence on you and your company.
Correct.
Do you recommend to your clients that they do due diligence on the people that are investing in them?
There is certain requirements for due diligence. You have to know who your investors are. Typically, the lawyers help you out with that. We have what's called an investor questionnaire. Okay. What that investor questionnaire does is confirms for the company that they do meet those Regulation D, whichever part of the code you're relying on, criteria in order to be an investor. and you don't run afoul of any of the securities laws when dealing with that person. Certain things like, do they have the right income threshold, or do they have the right net asset value thresholds, which can't take into account their primary residence, knowledge, experience, all those sort of things is where the legal team comes in to make sure that they're getting the information validated by your investors, which the company can hold on to tell the SEC, we meet the exemption. So therefore, we didn't have to register at this point in time. And there's some public filings with Reg Ds that we do to the general community, to the SEC, Tech Crunch. We get those out so that way the whole world knows what fundraising round we did and how many investors. And sometimes the investors want that to be acknowledged that they were a part of it, just for their own VC firm and even for the company standpoint to say, look who we're aligned with.
Right. And then, okay, so now we're at almost the finish line. I would imagine there has to be some kind of agreement that has to be drafted, and it needs to be legally sound.
That's right. And so that last document depends upon what we're doing. It could be, this is debt, and you're going to have a, investment into the overall debt note that's there. It could be for stock or shares in the company, a subscription agreement. But actually, it's a multitude of documents that work together all the way back to what I was saying, that PPM, that private placement memorandum that says, here's the business that we are, here's what we see are the risks. We have your investor questionnaire to make sure we've checked the boxes of you as an investor qualifying to be with us. So we've told you about us in that PPM. You've told us about you as an investor. Now the last thing is that subscription agreement to say, look, now we're going to sell you the shares. Here's what it is. Here's what it means to be an investor. Here's the corporate documents that go with those, talking about rights and the privileges you have as an owner. All those come as a package that the lawyers take care of to make sure that they actually sell that stock or that interest in that note.
And then the final step, getting the money. How does that work?
Yeah, typically, like we're in the middle of one today. Actually, we'll put it into the wire funds. We'll send that wire the wire statement to the company with our subscription agreement, and just say, look, we're sending that to you upon your counter signature of the subscription agreement or the counter documents, and then they can take the funds. Typically, you just do that back and forth, saying, hey, here's the money, but I need to get my part as well, and it's by wire transfer. Pretty easy to do. But again, investors as well, if you're a founder that also is an investor, holding on to the documents you're signing and making sure you have those are critical, because that's the ticket to make sure you can get information should a founder say thank you very much for the money and now they go dark. There are state laws and federal laws with regard to required disclosure, but I must show that I'm a shareholder and or a member of that entity in order to get it. So hold on to that
paperwork
stuff.
is your proof.
It is. It's just like the deed to the house. Hold on to it.
Okay, great. Well, I think talking about everything from very early stages of funding all the way to government grants, loans, SBA money, to getting the big check.
Right.
I think you've done a really great job of outlining kind of what is involved with funding your new company or your startup.
Well, thank you for
founders.
this. This has been great to be able to talk through stuff. Yeah, I mean, this community, we both know, we're still a little early compared to a lot of them, but there's going to be a lot more of this activity out there for our founders and the community here to engage in. And it's going to become more, like you said, we were talking about earlier, the more you go down the road, the more common it becomes, but we're still a little early on going down those roads. So it's been great to be able to talk about it with you here today.
Well, thank you so much for having me today, Matt. And it's been my pleasure being able to ask you all of these questions that founders ask me. And then I say, I'm the writer. I'm not the lawyer.
And on that too, I tell our audience, check out startupsanantonio.com, because you're providing all that real-time information and newsworthy information of the people that are going down these roads.
Series A, Series B,
grant
seed
awards,
round,
and everything else. So we'll make sure that we have that in the description here of our post to make sure that we can refer people to. It's a great source for me. I'm always seeing what's going on the tech scene. You've got a great map of the ecosystem for people that want to know what are the resources available, which we've talked a lot about. You do a great job of aggregating that. So I'd ask our viewers and our listeners, go check that out. It's going to be in our description. Check that out as well.
No, thanks so much.
Well, thank you for watching and listening to us. If you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any of the other platforms that are out there, click subscribe or send us a comment. Let us know that we're providing value for you. If you're watching us on YouTube, we'd ask also that you click subscribe. Leave us a comment as well, just making sure that we're getting you the information you need here for San Antonio and South Texas. And until next time, we'll see you later.